All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And welcome to CETA and the Arts, a lunchtime Zoom hosted by the Free Library of Philadelphia's Art Department and Print and Picture Collection. I'm Laura Straffolino. I'm the curator of the Print and Picture Collection, and my co-host is art librarian Alina Jozan. Let me open up my PowerPoint real quick. Sorry about that. There we go. And there's the art department and the print and picture collection. So today's discussion is part of programming for the exhibition For the Greatest Number, The New Deal Revisited, which is on view on the third floor of Parkway Central Library, Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. And it's on view through February 4th, 2022. We also have an exhibition website at freelibrary.org /greatest number. And there you can find links to our digital collection, blog post, a Spotify playlist, and a podcast about CETA, book lists, and information about related events, including recordings of previous Zoom talks. For the Greatest Number includes art and objects funded by New Deal programs that help illustrate how workers shaped the country during the 1930s. New Deal agencies employed 20 million workers, including about 10,000 people working for the Federal Art Project as part of the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. The WPA inspired a federal law enacted by Congress in 1973, the Comprehensive Employment and Training Act, known as CETA. CETA trained workers and provided jobs in public service. During its 8-year run, CETA came to include many programs providing employment in the arts. According to the Department of Labor, it was responsible for the largest single financial contribution to American culture in the history of the nation, about $1 billion in 2021 dollars. And what is really surprising is that after working on the exhibition about the New Deal for over a year, I'd never heard of CETA until I read an article about the program in the Philadelphia Inquirer in April of this year. It was through this article that we've been able to make this connection between the New Deal era and CETA. And we are so happy to have 3 presenters with us today to talk about CETA. And thank you and welcome to CETA Arts alums, Virginia Maksymowicz and Blaise Tobia, and dance historian, Dr. Colleen Hooper. Virginia and Blaise are visual artists based in Philadelphia. Each holds the title of Professor Emeritus, Virginia from Franklin and Marshall College, and Blaise from Drexel University. In 1978 and 1979, both were employed under the Cultural Council Foundation's CETA Artist Project in New York City. Blaise was a photographer for its documentation unit. Model for cultural recovery. For the past 5 years, they have been leaders in the development of the CETA Arts Legacy Project, a nationwide coalition of CETA alumni and arts and government professionals seeking to secure the place of CETA in the history of federal funding of the arts. As part of this effort, the exhibition Artwork, which documents the contributions of the CETA program to the arts in New York City, recently opened at City Lore and Cucifrito's Galleries, 2 venues on the Lower East Side. Dr. Colleen Hooper is assistant professor of dance at Point Park University and chair of the Department of Dance. She researches the history of public funding for arts programs in the United States from the New Deal through the present day. Dr. Hooper will be talking about 3 CETA artists in Philadelphia. And we'll also hear from Alina about CETA-related resources available in the Philadelphia Free Library's art department. And we'll have some time at the end for discussion and questions, so feel free to leave comments in the chat as we go. And now we'll start with the presentation by Virginia Maksymowicz and Blaise Tobia.
Greetings to everyone from our Palatine Village Operating Center. And I'm going to bring up our PowerPoint. Laura, are we good? Okay. So just again, a plug for the great show at the library right now. If you haven't seen it, curated by Laura along with Caitlin Goodman. In our opinion, it has an amazing selection. It's a small space, but very, very well chosen artworks, objects, and documents showing the wide range of the WPA art programs, which there were several of, right? Not just the Federal Artist Project. So anyway, it's been 90 years, though, since the Great Depression, inspired the New Deal to create this set of programs. And just about everybody knows about them, right? They're part of our shared kind of cultural patrimony. But it's only been a little more than 45 years since the crisis of the 1970s. And that crisis inspired a similar program to be created. Like the WPA, artists were employed with federal funds.
Okay, we have some of the same images that Laura showed. And the library is the one who found this patch, which is amazing. But as Blaise said, nearly everyone has heard of the WPA, but few have heard about CETA, and Laura mentioned that too. And under the Comprehensive Employment and Training Act, which is what CETA is an acronym for, at least 10,000 artists, visual artists, actors, musicians, dancers, poets, you name it, were employed under this federal program. But in addition, CETA provided an additional 10,000 art support jobs, curators, museum guards, theater technicians, administrative positions, and other staff that benefited cultural institutions and performing arts venues and arts groups. CETA was signed into law by Richard Nixon on December 23rd, right before Christmas in 1973. And it was a bipartisan endeavor, which is something to take into consideration today. Republicans were able to support the legislation because of the structure, block grants to states that redistributed the funds to regions, municipalities, and even Native American reservations. CETA was designed to be a temporary response to a deep recession and high unemployment, and also high inflation. Initially conceived as a training program for unskilled workers, it was amended to include new sections called titles for trained workers in professions suffering from chronic and underemployment. CETA was not designed with the employment of artists in mind. Unlike the WPA, there was no dedicated arts, theater, or music projects included in the legislation itself. But this man, John Kreidler, devised a way in which CETA funds could be used to employ artists. Right after college, he spent 5 years working in various government positions in Washington, D.C., and he actually helped draft the original CETA legislation. While an arts administration intern at the San Francisco Arts Commission, he recognized that the commission's neighborhood arts program could fit within the community service component of CETA Titles 2 and 6. So we got together with artist Ruth Asawa, who was running the NAP program, and he made it happen. San Francisco became a model for the rest of California and ultimately for the rest of the country. Kreidler was inspired by the WPA's employment of artists in service to the community. Unlike the NEA, which gave unrestricted grants to artists, CETA artists, had to work for the public good. CETA was administered by the Department of Labor, which meant that it had to follow federal non-discrimination guidelines. Many working class and minority artists who often didn't have the professional connections to get private funding benefited especially from CETA. At its peak in the mid-1970s, the San Francisco Neighborhood Arts Program employed over 120 artists creating and presenting work citywide, and gave tens of thousands of city residents access to arts classes and arts presentations in their neighborhoods. Similar programs soon followed. There were large ones like Chicago's Artists in Residence program, Washington's Arts DC, and New York City's Cultural Council Foundation Artist Project. Many more artists were hired throughout the country, including in Philadelphia, in smaller programs or as individuals. As well, and this often is not remembered, hundreds of nonprofit arts organizations were kickstarted and/or stabilized through CETA funding, ranging from artist-run galleries to large museums. All right, this is my surprise. All right, I mentioned to Laura that I had a little bit of a surprise today in the presentation. What you're looking at is a slide of a t-shirt I made for the College Art Association panel we were doing about CETA in 2019. Well, yesterday in the mail, this arrived. You can see it. It's a t-shirt from 1975 from San Francisco, John Kreidler's own t-shirt that was made by an artist named Jack Yu about being a CETA artist. So we've got to get this into the archive, but it literally arrived yesterday. All right, so back to the script. At its peak in 1980, and Laura referred to $1 billion, but listen to this. At its peak in 1980, CETA funding for arts employment funneled between $200 and $300 million into the arts. This is 1980. About $1 billion in 2021 dollars. All right. In comparison, the NEA budget for that year was only $159 million. So we're talking about 1 year here. The impact that CETA had on the cultural sector was enormous. And like the WPA, it set a trajectory for contemporary art continuing to this day. Yet it's largely been forgotten. Why?
Okay, so why has it been forgotten? Well, we've been trying to figure this out, and we've come up with what we think are some pretty good reasons. One is that its structure was decentralized, right? Unlike the centralized WPA projects, the block grants were given to the states. They were subsequently distributed to counties, municipalities, in the case of New York City, to boroughs and borough presidents' offices. And there were, according to George Koch, over 500 recipients of CETA funding, right? Another problem, of course, because it was decentralized, the records are decentralized. There is no central archive, not even within New York City, let alone nationally, right? So we had the experience of trying to track down the documents in the New York City Municipal Archives. We found 55 boxes worth. We were told that's all there was. They just had documents. They didn't have photographs or video or audio tapes. It took us several more years before we discovered there were 16 other boxes at another location. And in some ways for us, that was, a great find, because we did find the photographs, audio tapes, and early films. Multiply this scenario by 49 other states, the District of Columbia, and the US territories, and it becomes apparent that a comprehensive record of CETA's contributions would be virtually impossible to assemble. And with more than the 500 jurisdictions that I spoke to, it would be an amazing task to try to take that on. Number two, as Virginia has already said, CETA was a jobs program. It was not an arts funding program, right? Some artists were kind of surprised when they were told they would have to work and actually punch the clock, in essence. Community groups, libraries, schools, museums, artist-run galleries, a range of nonprofits were the direct employees of the CETA artists who made their contribution in the form of service. While documentation exists, buried deep in those organizations' files, there is little institutional memory. For example, the website of the Richmond Hill Historical Society in New York credits me for a set of photographs that they still use on their website, right? But CETA is not mentioned. I personally am recognized as the photographer, but no one at Richmond Hill remembers that this was through a CETA placement, supporting the community. And something that we learned, I think, from the Free Library Show, and we spoke to Laura about this, is that another reason CETA just isn't in the public mind in the same way that the WPA is that the WPA was part of a comprehensive campaign. Some might even characterize it as propaganda, right? To promote FDR's programs for national recovery. The campaign familiarized all Americans with the WPA and its arts projects. On the contrary, CETA had no slogans, no program posters, no newsreels. And more than that, it didn't have a nationally based program like the Treasury Relief Project that put iconic murals into post offices all around the country, right? This happens to be the Lakeview Post Office in Chicago.
Instead, CETA's murals were produced locally and individually in response to the needs of community sponsors. Although less well known, many public works produced by CETA artists stand on a par with their WPA predecessors. And I love these two photos, especially because the one on the right was taken by Blaise, and he didn't have knowledge of the WPA one on the left, and they're almost in the same pose, right? On the left is Marion Greenwood. The mural was in Brooklyn, and on the right is Alan Samalin from our project, the New York project, Earth Science at the Hall of Science in Flushing Meadow. Unfortunately, CETA murals, because they weren't centralized, did not have the same level of protection as the WPA murals had. So, for example, many of them have been removed, like Samalin's mural here. And some of the best CETA murals, at least ones in New York that we know of, were destroyed. For example, Cynthia Mailman's mural, Commuter Landscape, which was for the path entrance at the World Trade Center, welcomed travelers for 14 years before it was destroyed in the 1993 bombing at the Trade Center. Similarly, Hunt Sloanim's Fan Dancing with Birds, also at the World Trade Center, was destroyed on September 11, 2001. And there were two additional World Trade Center CETA murals lost in that attack, one by Jermaine Keller and one by James Biederman.
But in terms of studio work, and the great majority of work produced, at least in the New York projects, was studio-based work, because we each had to work in our studio a day a week. There was also a significant difference. Unlike the WPA, we didn't put our work in a central archive, right? We kept ownership of our own artwork unless it was made specifically for a community group. And not only that, we had shared copyright of those artworks with the Cultural Council Foundation. This stamp that you see on the screen, that had to be stamped on the back of the works we made. So Virginia and I are most familiar with the New York project because that's the project we worked in, right? We were two of approximately 500 accomplished but unemployed artists of all types who were given positions in that program. The largest of these, and the one for which we worked, was administered by the Cultural Council Foundation, an organization that provided services to arts nonprofits throughout the city. It employed 300 artists and 32 administrators in its first year. It did so well that first year that they were given 25 more lines for the second year. But our research on CETA's legacy has caused us to learn a whole lot more about CETA nationally and even here in Philadelphia. Stefan Salisbury wrote a great piece for the Inquirer last April, which maybe some of you read, with examples of how CETA impacted the Philadelphia arts community. The Inquirer itself, in 1978, had reported that Philadelphia spent about $600,000 of its $20.5 million in CETA allotment on public service arts programs. Bill Cleveland, director of the Center for the Study of Art and Community, puts it this way: to this day, there's CETA dust on many programs.
And I really like that term, CETA dust, and we're discovering more of that dust every day. This is a picture of Cheryl McClenny Brooker, who was New York City's Assistant Commissioner of Cultural Affairs in the mid-1970s. She was one of the designers of the CETA program that we worked under. In 1983, she took a position at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, where she eventually became Director of External Affairs. So there's kind of a direct link there. Unfortunately, we were hoping to interview her, but she died in May 2019, and we didn't get to do the oral history. Anne and Anne Edmunds organized what was probably the largest CETA artist project in Philadelphia. When Anne was executive director of the Print Club, she ran a CETA program from 1976 to 77, which employed approximately 20 artists. And Colleen will talk more about Anne in her presentation. Alan, founder and president of the Brandywine Workshop, ran Visual Arts and Public Service, VAPS, from 1977 to 1980 with CETA funds. And this employed artists all across the city. In 1977, when the Painted Bride was a small artist-run gallery, they got 6 CETA staffers for 2 years, which helped them with administration, theater management, promotion, fundraising, and maintenance, and put them in a position to become what it eventually became. There's also CETA dust on People's Light and Theater, which had more than 20 CETA positions. Bruce Katzeff told us that the Bucks County Community College Artmobile, which is still going, got its start with CETA. Marcia Moss remembers that the Cheltenham Art Center was, in her words, kept alive through CETA funding.
The Please Touch Museum benefited from CETA through Brandywine's visual artists and public service placements, as did the Community Education Center right here in our neighborhood. The Philadelphia Architects Workshop, the predecessor to the current Community Design Collaborative, had 8 CETA positions. The National Museum of American Jewish History, in its earlier location in a synagogue, had at least 1 CETA artist position that we know of.
Mural Arts was founded by Jane Golden, who learned her trade as a CETA artist painting murals in Santa Monica, California. Even larger institutions are covered in CETA dust. The Philadelphia Museum of Art employed at least 38 staffers through CETA. And I have to point out that Senga Nangudi, who just had a big retrospective at the museum, was a CETA artist early in her career in Los Angeles. But wait, there's more. And I'm just going to flash these slides at you. All right. So you have Philadelphia metro area, Westchester, Camden County. All right. And you can see some of the names of the artists.
And these are some of the individual artists that we've been able to identify who were employed through the CETA programs in Philadelphia. Richard Watson, of course, who now heads the African American Museum, or at least head curator of it.
Dancers, and Colleen has tracked down the names of many of the dances, but we haven't found them all. It seems that there were at least 9 musicians and poets hired in Philadelphia, but we don't know their names. We do know about 2 writers, Charles Bernstein, who was at our project, who became professor at Penn. And this is interesting. Charles Hardy, who's a professor of history at Westchester University, worked as humanist in residence at WHYY and produced some of the first programs for Fresh Air, along with Terry Gross.
Mm-hmm. Lots of CETA dust.
Colleen is going to talk about Johnnie Hobbs, but there were other actors whose names we don't know.
And then finally, this is just a little pitch for the 2 shows up in New York, which are on for a couple of months, should you get up there, at these 2 very nice little galleries on the Lower East Side. That's a view of the City Lore show. A number of those photographs were by me. Lots of documentation and historical material. And then the other part of the show is in the Cuchi Fritos Gallery in the Essex Street Market.
And this show is in conjunction with a planned show at the Delaware Art Museum, where Margaret Winslow is researching what happened in Wilmington and Delaware. And finally, if you want to help in this effort, if you were a CETA artist, please let us know. Tell us about your experiences. You can contact us through the CETA Arts website. There's a link there.
Okay, and now we're going to be turning it over to Colleen.
Right. So take it away, Colleen.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to Laura, to Alina, and to Virginia and Blaise. This is really an amazing opportunity. I'm happy to be here with all of you. So what I'm going to be sharing today is some of my research specifically about Philadelphia. My 2016 dissertation at Temple University did focus on both the Philadelphia and the New York City projects, but today I'm going to be talking about some of the Philadelphia specific information. So just a little bit of context, unlike Virginia and Blaise, I was not a CETA artist. And so the way that I became involved is that I was researching Martha Bowers, who has done a lot of dance and community work in New York City. And she told me about this program that she was part of, that she worked for the federal government at this point, kind of early in her career. And I was fascinated because what she described sounded so unlike anything I'd ever heard of. So being, interested in research, I went to find the books about this. And then I discovered that there weren't any. And, that I was able to find footnotes. I was able to find references here and there to CETA Arts, but it was something that, I couldn't find the type of material that I was hoping for. Oh, greetings from Brooklyn. Okay, great. So there was a lack of research. And then also the fact that as a young artist in New York City, I was really perplexed by how something like this could have existed, because in the days that I was in New York, kind of early 2000s through about 2008, there was such an emphasis on private foundation funding. And so I was curious about what this era looked like and what we could learn from it. And I wanted to know what we could learn in terms of how this impacted dancers, being that I'm in dance, but also the arts field at large. So in terms of my focus, I discussed how the federal CETA program supported art as public service. And basically at a local level, similar to what Virginia and Blaise said, local programs defined art as public service. So they were given the funds at a federal level, and then they were really able to make sense of the program as they saw fit. So CETA artists had what I would say was a very large calling, which was to imagine a public to serve, to figure out how they were engaging with the public, to negotiate government funding, and also performing artists performed in public spaces for free admission. So looking a little deeper into some of these stories, as it was mentioned, Anne Edmunds. So in 1977, Pennsylvania funded 60 CETA artist positions, and this was relatively small compared to some of the other programs going on nationwide. For instance, in that same year, New York had 683 positions. There were 340 positions in California, 43 in New Jersey, 195 in Maryland, and 119 in Delaware. Anne Edmunds, as an arts administrator, worked directly with the Pennsylvania Secretary of State, James Wade, to implement the CETA Arts programs in Philadelphia. She had been a consultant for the Pennsylvania Council on the Arts in the 1970s, and for 5 years, she was also the executive director of the Print Club, which many of you may know is a nonprofit gallery space, which was founded in 1915. Philadelphia's first CETA Arts program began in 1975, and it closely followed that initial San Francisco, California program that Virginia and Blaise mentioned. Edmunds ran the CETA program through the Print Club from 76 through 77, and she had approximately 20 artists. She left the Print Club and joined Brandywine Workshop, and that program operated from 1977 through 1980. Director Alan Edmunds, who you'd also seen in the previous slide, conceived the Visual Artists and Public Service Program, known as VAPS, V-A-P-S. And this goal was to teach children and adults who normally would not have the opportunity to work in the arts. As an African-American woman, Anne Edmunds was also sensitive to the need to serve diverse populations within the charge. There was also an emphasis on artists spending time in the studio and having time to produce their own work. The artists in the VAPS program were encouraged to do projects in vacant lots, and they also created murals and also public artworks in these spaces. They've really focused on the process of creating murals, and I think that this is important because unlike the Mural Arts Project, which was founded by Jane Golden in 1984, the Brandywine Workshop artists really focused on community outreach more so than accumulating works of art. So they had to do with creating a dialogue about the arts within community, and it wasn't really about preserving the murals once they were created. This is significant because Edmunds emphasized the process of artists working in the community rather than the product of the mural that they created. I think it's interesting to reflect on what these CETA artists did, and each CETA artist designed a work plan, and this included aspects of public service and also time in their studio every week. And these plans were approved by Anne. There were meetings that brought the artists together. I wish I could have been a fly on the wall to kind of hear the dialogue between them. And they talked about the things they were doing, designing exhibits at the Please Touch Museum, as was mentioned, teaching art classes at the local Boys and Girls Clubs. Edmunds explained that during the staff meetings, the artists often inspired one another, and they also tried to outdo each other in terms of the projects that they were planning. They created an individualized work plan for the year, but they didn't have a choice of the site where they were working. So that was something they were assigned. And then within that, they were able to create their own plan. Edmunds defined public service as kind of a broad scope, providing children with arts education, beautifying and conserving neighborhoods, and also engaging community people in arts projects. So looking at the legacy, according to Edmunds, she credits CETA with the prevalence of community arts programs in local Philadelphia organizations today. For example, she talks about how during the time this was founded, there was really not a prevalence of art all over the city. And today there are, even in Boys and Girls Clubs and other organizations. She stated that the artist's greatest benefit was receiving the work experience. The artists they hired were not certified teachers. So writing a work plan based on artistic interest and strengths presented a great opportunity for artists to develop the skills while they were provided a salary and also logistical support. Through this process, artists became teachers, and Edmunds recalls that community groups and cultural organizations, such as the Philadelphia Museum of Art, hired many of these artists after CETA ended. As was mentioned, Richard Watson is a CETA alum, and he was a CETA artist. When he came to Brandywine Workshop, he had no previous teaching experience, but he developed a number of skills during his time with CETA, and then later became a curator at the African American Museum in Philadelphia. When I asked Edmunds why artists with successful careers often didn't mention their time with CETA, she offered the explanation that CETA was not known as an artist program. It was an employment program. For Edmunds, CETA's goal was not about what you were doing as much as making sure that you had a job. It was about employment and kind of developing skills along the way. While CETA's primary goal was to provide work to the unemployed, the Brandywine Workshop created their own interpretation, and they went beyond that mandate in terms of bringing arts to different neighborhoods. Okay, so that's Anne Edmunds. That's some of her story. I'm going to touch a bit on Terry Fox and also on Johnnie Hobbs, and I want to make sure we have time to discuss things as well. So Terry Fox is a dancer. Many of you local to Philadelphia may also know her because she's continued to be involved in the dance scene to this day. She started working for CETA in January of 1977. And one of the things I think is interesting is she was so enthusiastic about the opportunity to earn $10,000 a year for teaching dance in the community. She explained, "I don't think I'd ever made $10,000 in my entire life. And it was totally amazing. So it was like, for sure." In 2021, this salary would be equivalent to paying artists $47,500 to work part-time in community settings. Fox explained that it felt like having $1 million, and the schedule was somewhat flexible because it didn't require a strict 8-hour workday. Upon calculating what she did do each week with transportation and kind of moving between sites, it ended up being about 30 hours a week of work. When I asked what her experiences were, they kind of varied. She had low enrollment and a lack of support at a non-traditional school, which was known as the Parkway program. It was a program that really engaged with a lot of the cultural institutions along the Ben Franklin Parkway, but it was relatively short-lived. But she did have a really positive experience teaching at the Lutheran Settlement House, which was a place that she had taught prior. One of her successes, which she described, was collaborating with a visual artist named Joanne Cow. They created a children's performance based on the theme of dreams. And Cow created a backdrop and costumes for the performance. And Fox enjoyed this collaboration because the children split their time between dancing and making the costumes and scenery. Fox explained that the students gained a basic comprehension of dance technique and they began improvising, and the classes were very successful. In terms of her other engagement during this time, she maintained an active performing schedule, and she also presented or performed in 13 works and logged 31 performances during a 9-month period. So she was able to really pursue her own profession as well. She today is still active, and she's the founder of the Philadelphia Dance Project. Okay, just one more section here, because I know we want to make sure we have time for discussion. I'm going to discuss Johnnie Hobbs Jr. Actor Johnnie Hobbs Jr. began his employment with the Philadelphia company Freedom Theater. He began working with Freedom Theater in 1972, and CETA funding allowed him to transition from a volunteer role to a paid position. Following his CETA employment, he became the full-time director of admissions and training at Freedom Theater. Freedom Theater is historically significant because it's Philadelphia's oldest African-American theater, founded by John Allen in 1966. The theater's initial emphasis was producing plays with adult actors, but in 1971, Bob Leslie joined the organization and instituted a significant training program. Hobbs was really interested in becoming an actor himself, but he got into teaching and he was really surprised by how much he enjoyed it. And because he was successful with that, Allen and Leslie offered him a CETA position. Working for CETA allowed Hobbs to leave his job as a machinist and focus on acting and teaching full-time. CETA gave him time to practice his craft as a teacher and a performer. And he discussed 2 specific programs. He worked with youth in something called Open Connection, which was a youth organization in North Philadelphia. And he described developing a mutual understanding with this group of young people. The basis of his teaching was getting in touch with who you are as a person. He would have the students reflect upon their identity through monologues, playing theater games, developing scenes, and writing poetry. We would read out loud and just get an overall sense of who you are and what you're really expressing. And when you say these things, it's a total representation of who you are and what you believe. By connecting the theater students to personal motivations and identity, Hobbs built strong relationships with class participants, and he felt that his teaching benefited the group as a whole. He also worked with Hobbs and Allen worked together and did a program at the Holmesburg prison in Philadelphia. The thing that I wanted to highlight, just kind of wrapping up here, is that he felt that CETA brought him a sense of independence and responsibility. It gave him a strong foundation for his acting and teaching career. And after he was reflecting back, he felt that it brought him to a productive place. And he says, and I quote, "Everybody needs a handout sometimes. Everybody needs to feel that they are worth it. So if anything, it develops self-worth. It develops a sense of doing, and it makes you feel that you're a whole human being. And because of that, I've been quite successful." Freedom Theater continues to produce a number of plays each year and has won numerous awards for its performances and training programs. Hobbs notes that he never received advanced educational degrees, but his professional theater experience made him eligible to teach at Temple University part-time for 5 years, and then he began teaching at University of the Arts in 1983. And he became a tenured associate professor at University of the Arts, and he retired in the mid-2010s after teaching there for 30 years. So those are some stories from local people, and there's so much more, but that was kind of what I wanted to share with everyone today and make sure that we have time to discuss. So thank you so much for listening. And I'll put my contact information up here just in case somebody wants to jot that down and hand it back over to the rest of the group. Thank you, Laura.
Wow, thank you so much. That most of this information is new to me. It's wonderful. I don't know if Alina has anything that she wanted to share from the art department right now, but we do have a lot of questions in the chat, or questions and comments in the chat. Alina, did you want to talk about the art department and how it can support learning more about CETA?
Yeah, I'll make this very brief so that people can have a conversation. But now, thanks to Virginia, Blaise, and Colleen's efforts, I'm anticipating a deluge of researchers coming in to request information about some of the things they've learned today. So I want people to know that, you know, you can search our catalog at freelibrary.org and find things like published materials on the Brandywine workshop, for example. This is just one of several books. Books on individual artists like Barbara Bullock, who was mentioned as one of the Philadelphia CETA artists, and also amazing collection of periodicals. So, for example, this is Art Facts. This is a published newsletter from 1970s Philadelphia on goings on in the arts community. So, you know, here's a Painted Bride event that is listed there. So that's one thing that you can discover through the catalog. But I also wanted people to know that in addition to materials there, we have a collection of archival materials. We have what we call the research file collection in the art department, and a lot of individual artists and arts institutions in the area are documented here. So here's a file on the Brandywine workshop. The first article mentions Art Park, the mural program that we were just talking about. There are clippings here from local publications that have not been digitized. So the Bulletin, Chestnut Hill Local. So lots of great local sources. So lots of materials on the Brandywine workshop. Similarly, the Painted Bride. So just to give you a sense of the kind of material we have here. Sorry, I'm just holding up things quickly. You know, the Cheltenham Center for the Arts was mentioned. Here it is at the Cheltenham Township Arts Center. These are files from the 1970s. Other individual artists, here's Lawrence Salzman. So just come into the art department and start a conversation with us, and we'll be able to help you. So yeah, I'd like to hear if anybody else has comments. If you'd like to unmute yourself, just jump in. Yeah.
I was wondering if I think it was called the Brandywine School. It was on a small street right next to what's the high school on Broad Street? Ben Franklin High School. I was wondering if they were part of the CETA program. I remember going there and they offered dance, and they even had a modeling class under designer Bill Norwood. And I was wondering if they were part of CETA.
So the Brandywine workshop moved a couple of times, but does anybody else know if that was one of their locations? I know you know, most recently they're on Broad Street, but they have, I feel like they were on at least two other locations before their current one.
They started on Brandywine Street, and that's where their name comes from.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not sure what block that was, so I don't know if it was the same organization.
I think it was Broad and Brandywine then. It's right next to, there's a little small street right next to Ben Franklin High School.
Mm-hmm. Well, Alan Edmunds was director then, and he's still director. And you know, as both Colleen and we said, Alan and his wife pretty much were the directors of all the CETA positions in the Philadelphia area.
Yeah, with the exception being companies that already existed. So there were nonprofits like the Freedom Theater that received funding. And as was mentioned in Stephen Salisbury's article, Joan Myers Brown, Philadanco, they got their first paychecks for dancers was through CETA. So CETA did fund directly to nonprofits, and it's really hard to get a list of who all of those are, but Blaise and Virginia did a great overview of the ones that have been found so far. But yeah, I don't know the answer in terms of the Brandywine School, but Alan and Anne are still around and they're great resources. I mean, I was able to look in their archives and they pretty much emphasize the VAPS program, the visual artists in public service. But there was a lot going on at that time and the records for it are really fragmented. So that's why I think it's also exciting to have this type of event, because honestly, I will always learn something from it, just from the whole group who's here. I'm sure everyone has their different experiences with it that brought you to this event. And the archive is scattered as Blaise and Virginia have established. So it's great to learn these things and to kind of follow up and see what else might be out there.
I did notice in the chat that several people put in comments about needing something like this again today. So maybe I'll throw a question out there to people on the Zoom. How would you imagine such a program happening today?
Well, it would be helpful, especially with our city in the gropes of gun violence, to initiate the CETA program again, not only for the arts but for the employment aspect. Like I said, I went through it for accounting clerk position, which is very valuable to me, because actually I had moved from here, Philadelphia, to California. So it gave me a marketable skill. And I do remember the job that I went to, which was a food forwarding export business. And I was like a 4.0 student in the program, but I know they offer other, secretarial positions and things like that. It will be very helpful today, because I think that's the biggest problem that we have with the violence is the people have no skills and no talent to spring from the environment they're in.
Well, interestingly, something that probably could be done, and Americans for the Arts has talked about this, in the American Rescue Plan and, the infrastructure bill and, various parts of the legislation that the Biden administration is trying to push through Congress, there's an area called workforce development. And I do know Americans for the Arts thinks that some of that could be used to hire artists. And, on the most mundane level, someone's got to document, or they should document, the rebuilding of bridges or the repaving of roads. And a lot of that kind of stuff employed photographers during the WPA. If money is put into schools, well, maybe part of it can go to the arts, so that artists are working with the children to do artworks in the schools. In a way, what I really found intriguing researching CETA was that, as I said, it's not like with the WPA, it was conceived that there'd be a federal art project and a federal writers project and these parts of the legislation that were targeted at the cultural sector. CETA, if John Cardler, Ruther Sauer, and some of those early people looking at the legislation hadn't come up with the idea that maybe you can use it, it wouldn't have been used. So I think we have to, look closely at some of the legislation that's coming down the pike.
I think it's also interesting to think about some of the programs that were enacted around the 2008 economic downturn. And there was a big emphasis there on like shovel-ready projects. And Madeline Cantor, who I didn't get to her story just because we were a little low on time, but it's interesting because she was a CETA artist, but then she also received funding during the 2008-2009 when we were in that economic downturn. So her story is interesting. And I think one of my things that I find inspiring is that CETA helped build up this huge infrastructure of arts that we have here today. I mean, I know the arts could always be more supported, but we do have community art centers now, and we do have a lot of nonprofits. And so I think it would be interesting to kind of, as Virginia's saying, like advocate for building upon these organizations that have the CETA dust and the CETA roots, and how government funding for artists could help bolster and strengthen the organizations we have, like within communities all over the country.
Something else to remember is funding was kludged together. So yes, there was CETA money that was going into the arts, but I know from the New York program that money also came from the New York State Council on the Arts, New York Foundation for the Arts, the NEA. So there was, there might have been a CETA initiated program, but then a little more money was needed for an aspect of that. And then they were successful in grant applications. And now it could be a public-private partnership. If there was federal seed money that could get things going, maybe then the Pew and various other private funders would then add their money to that money.
I guess the last thing I'll say is that part of, in my ending section of my dissertation, I talk about Ted Weiss, who was a New York City politician, and he basically had a proposal for a federal artist project to follow CETA. And it didn't ever come to vote, but I think it's really interesting to look at that proposal because it was similar to what Virginia is saying. It was a public-private partnership where basically the government money would be 3/4, private money would be 25, and then over a course of 3 years, it would be more private money. It would get up to 75% private money, 25% government money, with this idea of encouraging private companies to hire artists within different capacities. So it's interesting, the history of this and what we could use and what could still be applicable today.
Right. And Colleen, picking up on that, the largest chunk of money right now being used to employ artists in the whole country is a project in New York State, right? Funded by private money, 125 million, in fact. So, and they were actually supporters of the 2 shows up in New York. So we're grateful to them.
But actually getting back to the Weiss bill, if anybody wants to read that, you can Google it. It's on Google Books, but we have a copy of that in the digital archive. That's open access. If you go to CETAArts.com, you click on the archive and it'll bring you right there.
All right, and that's a good segue. So I just included the link to CETAArts.com in the chat, but when this is done, and we will send a recording out to everybody who registered for it, and we'll also send you a list of really useful links to Dr. Hooper's dissertation, Blaise and Virginia's project, and things like that. So we'll send you a list of links. It's 12:59, so I think it's time to wrap up. This has been amazing. I'm so glad to be able to have all of these people here, and to have Dr. Hooper, Blaise, and Virginia here to talk about CETA. And thank you so much.
See you at the library.
Thank you.